Hello there, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of the Diablo 3 Build Factory. My name is Phobos, and today's topic will be on what needs to be changed concerning Demon Hunter skills. And I decided to do this episode because most of the time we speak about nerfs and what needs to be nerfed and what should not have been nerfed and topics like that. But really rarely we talk about skills that actually need to be changed or buffed, and I decided to do this episode because I wanted to emphasize this topic. A few skills are not really that useful at the moment and they really need some major buffs. So without further ado, let's get to the three most awful skills as of now, and then let's talk about how they could be made better. So one thing I want to clarify before we get to the skills first. I decided to pick 3 skills that are actually awful with every single rune you can pick, at least awful in Inferno difficulty and not viable for this difficulty mode. And while they have awesome concept at times, they are really, like I already said, awful, and they can't be used in Inferno difficulty properly or like they were meant to be. So the first skill I want to talk about is Strafe. And don't get me wrong, I really like the concept of Strafe. It is a really awesome concept that you can move while you're shooting, and especially that you can shoot in every direction and that arrows and bolts are homing. It is really awesome if you think about it. If you're kiting champion packs, for instance, you can walk away from them while you can still harm them. That's actually a pretty nice concept, but there's one major flaw with this skill, and that is that Strafe does way too less damage. It is way too less damage for Inferno difficulty, at least in my opinion. So if you think about it, Strafe actually does a decent amount of damage if you are fighting like 1 or 2 enemies, such as when you are kiting champions, for instance. But actually Strafe was meant to be that you are fighting a lot of enemies at once, that you can shoot enemies which surrounded you, for instance. But actually the more enemies you are facing with Strafe, the less effective it gets, and actually that's quite dumb because Strafe wasn't meant to be that way. So I really wonder what Blizzard thought when they designed this skill, and maybe they didn't come to realize that it is too weak because only a small minority uses the skill, and for good reasons. The thing is, due to the low damage that Strafe does, it isn't really hatred efficient also, so you can see that in the content right here. It is really not that hatred efficient. You can run into a lot of enemies, use Strafe, and you don't even kill them, even if they are not champions, and that's simply not enough damage. So now we have to ask ourselves, how can the skill be made more viable for Inferno difficulty? And in my opinion, the answer is Strafe should receive a slight damage buff. And I don't talk numbers like 160 or 170%, that's way too much obviously. But I talk numbers like a 135 than 120, for instance, or 140. I think that if the damage output would be at 135%, for instance, this skill would be much more popular. You have to take into account that crit damage, for instance, also benefits from the overall damage buff, and I think if the skill would have been buffed earlier, or if it is buffed in the near future, this skill will be much more popular and end up in many more builds on the internet. So I hope Blizzard will look into that as soon as possible. The next skill I want to talk about is Reign of Vengeance, and I really like the concept of ultimates or ultimate skills, and I really like them since Warcraft 3 times. And I really like skills which temporarily change the environment or have a really big AoE, and I'm really fond of them. But the thing with Reign of Vengeance is it does an okay amount of damage and it has no hatred use, and that's really nice if we consider that hatred is really important for Inferno difficulty, especially how you replenish your hatred for Inferno. But there's one major flaw again with this skill, and this major flaw is that Reign of Vengeance has a cooldown which is way too long. 30 seconds is way too long for Reign of Vengeance, and that's the main reason why so few people actually use this skill, because 30 seconds is a really long time in Diablo 3. And if we consider the damage output, which is actually kind of okay, it is, with my equipment, it is about 80k or 90k. It isn't enough if we consider the whole DPS amount. If we consider that you can only do damage every 30 seconds, and if we consider that monsters run out of the AoE if you are kiting them, for instance, this skill is really useless. Even if you use Stampede, which is supposed to push your enemies away, it only lasts for about 5 seconds and the damage output isn't enough, especially against champions. So that's why a lot of people don't use the skill. It needs to have an overall buff. And in my opinion, this skill could be made so much better if the cooldown was decreased by half of the amount. If it had a cooldown for like 15 seconds, that would actually be okay, at least in my opinion. So the skill could be so much better if it has like 50 seconds cooldown. In my opinion, it would be even okay if it costs hatred, therefore. Maybe they should do a rune which applies this concept to the skill. But whatever the case, Blizzard needs to buff the skill. How they do it, I don't care. Maybe they should buff the damage, but in my opinion, they should decrease the cooldown. Now to the last and most probably the most awful skill. Doesn't matter which rune you use for the Demon Hunter. And I'm talking about the grenades. They do an okay amount of damage if you use the single grenade, but apart from that, this skill is simply awful. Seriously, it is so awful. I don't know what they were thinking when they decided to do this skill, or when they developed the skill, because actually the concept is nice that a Demon Hunter also has gadgets like grenades, but if you use them in Inferno difficulty, most of the time it will get you killed. And in my opinion, there's little to no use for the skill anyways, because the skill does way too less damage, especially on Inferno. And the thing is, what makes it even worse, you have little to no control over the damage you can inflict to your enemies. You throw 3 grenades at a time, and well, granted, they have a bigger AoE than bola shots, for instance, but most of the time you won't harm enemies with these grenades, and like I already said, damage amount is ridiculously low. And apart from that, somehow the throw animation feels really stiff. I don't know if it's just me, but I can't really stutter step backwards with grenades. It's really stiff for some reason. I don't know why. It just feels wrong. I don't know if it's just me, or maybe you have other experiences with that, but I really can't use grenades efficiently in a solid fight, so I always try to avoid this skill. Well, and how can the skill be fixed and made more viable for Inferno difficulty? Quite frankly, I don't even know. I have no idea how the skill could be made more viable for Inferno difficulty. It needs a major buff or a major overhaul change how the skill is actually used, but in my opinion, maybe Blizzard should just replace the skill entirely. It is really not that useful and hardly anyone uses it, and again, for good reasons. It really sucks, and in my opinion it is the worst skill the Demon Hunter has overall, so something needs to change. And now it's your turn. Actually, I'm really interested on which skills you consider the most awful for the Demon Hunter and how they should be buffed or changed by Blizzard. So if you have any suggestions or ideas for skills and how they should be made more popular or how they should be made more effective, just leave them in the comment section below. I'm really looking forward to your ideas. But as for me, that's it for today. Thank you very much for watching, it's really much appreciated. As always, if you enjoyed this episode, make sure to press the like button, and if you want to stay up to date for more action of the Diablo 3 build factory, make sure to subscribe. As always, it's really much appreciated. Thank you for your support. Keep these questions and ideas or discussion topics coming, and I will see you guys next time. Take care, have a good one, and goodbye.